CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. World leaders set out to tackle climate change at the World Economic Forum. But is it any more than hot air?
Our other headlines: AstraZeneca versus the EU. The drug maker and the European Union fall out over a vaccine shortfall.
Boeing's highs and lows. EU-regulators clear the 737 MAX for a return to the skies, but the plane maker unveils record losses.
And once the stuff of science fiction, how virtual reality is increasingly becoming part of all our working lives. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has addressed the World Economic Forum for the first time in more than a decade. During his keynote speech, he warned global tensions could lead to conflict and said an international effort is needed to prevent societies from collapsing. Our correspondent Juliet Mann has been watching events. Juliet.
Thanks, Jamie. Well, Putin's address started and ended on a positive note. He spoke about Tuesday's phone call with new US President Joe Biden and their agreement to extend the New START nuclear arms treaty. He also recognised the importance of multilateralism. But the bulk of his speech took a darker turn after criticising the power of tech firms, saying social media giants are competing with governments. And he warned that civilization's being threatened by tensions caused by COVID.
It is well known that in the 20th century, the failure and inability to essentially resolve such issues resulted in a catastrophic World War II. Of course, nowadays, such a heated conflict is not possible. I hope that it's not possible in principle, because it will mean the end of our civilization. But I would like to reiterate, however, that the situation might develop unpredictably and uncontrollably if we will sit on our hands doing nothing to avoid it. And there is a possibility that we may experience an actual collapse of global development that might result in a fight of all against all.
Israel's Prime Minister spoke about how his country is spearheading one of the world's fastest vaccination drives. Benjamin Netanyahu announced that 82% of the over 60s have already been vaccinated. He said having already had a digitised data platform in place, the key was securing doses early and then distributing them and sharing that information with the rest of the world.
I think the important thing is not merely what we've done for Israel, but the fact that Israel can serve as basically a global, really, truly a global test case, not for dangerous experiments, but to understand this safe experiment that we're carrying out, what is the best way and what is the efficacy of using this and later Moderna inoculation to move the economies forward, to open up the economies. What risk are we taking? What's the infection rate and so on?
Now, coronavirus may have bumped climate off the top of the Davos agenda, but saving the planet is still one of the summit's priorities. The European Commission President has already said that the main 5 global risks are all related to the environment. And if temperatures keep rising and nature keeps disappearing, we'll see more natural disasters and zoonotic diseases. Well, 2020, along with 2016, was the joint hottest year on record. Global temperatures are now about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. In the Arctic, temperatures are rising at twice the global rate. Now, floods affected more than 10 million people across China, India, Nepal, and Japan. And there were a record 29 tropical storms in the Atlantic last year, with a record 12 of those making landfall. The World Economic Forum says tossing up that damage bill comes to $14 billion. And wildfires in America cost more than $12 billion. In Australia, bushfires released about 3/4 of the CO2 the country's industry emitted in 2018 to 2019. So, what action is being taken? Well, today, Mission Possible was launched to help transform heavy industry and transport, which represents 30% of global greenhouse emissions. The worst offenders include shipping, aviation and trucking companies. So now more than 400 firms have signed up to the partnership, working to achieve a net zero carbon future. Governments, too, are playing their part. China is working to become carbon neutral by 2060. It's increasing the use of non-fossil fuels for energy consumption and is banning single-use plastics. Now, Europe, they're dedicating 37% of its $900 billion recovery plan to the EU Green Deal. It's agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and says that it will protect at least 30% of land and sea. It also plans to plant 1 trillion trees this decade. And in the United States, which under Joe Biden has rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. Now, they're due to announce new measures to combat climate change. The president is set to sign a series of actions thought to include further reductions in gas emissions and a push towards renewable energy. Well, former Secretary of State John Kerry is US envoy for climate, and he's been speaking at the summit.
Domestic action cannot possibly be enough if we don't together forge an international strategy to galvanize the world, to drive greater ambition from every country, every sector, and ensure that the clean energy future we need is global in scope and scale. The whole world has to come to this table to solve the problem. So we rejoin the international climate effort with humility, and I mean that, and ambition. Humility, because we know we've wasted 4 years in which we were inexcusably absent. Humility, knowing that today almost no country, and for certain no continent, is getting the job done. But we re-enter with ambition, knowing that at the COP in Glasgow in November, all nations have to raise our sights together, or we all fail together.
Nandita Parshad is Managing Director of the Sustainable Infrastructure Group at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I asked her how mobilising big finance can prevent climate catastrophe.
You know, we all know the energy sector is absolutely crucial in the fight against climate change. 75% of global emissions come from the energy sector. So transforming the sector and accelerating to clean energy is absolutely essential for the fight against climate change. And it's also a sector that's heavily capital intensive. So finance is key. If we fail the finance challenge, we fail the energy transition challenge. And if we fail the energy transition challenge, well, we fail the climate challenge with catastrophic consequences globally.
You talk about the finance challenge. So how do you motivate big finance to see climate change as an opportunity rather than a risk?
Now, the good news is that clean energy is now the cheapest source of energy. It also has tremendous environmental benefits, it brings energy security, and it creates jobs, which can drive the economic recovery. The other really good news is that there is big capital out there, as you mentioned. There's capital available looking for investments that are sustainable and green. And particularly as we come out from this pandemic, you can see already the enthusiasm for finance to find clean and green homes. So the real challenge, and which is what we focus on this morning as well, is how do we bring that capital that is out there looking for sustainable investment to actually into emerging markets? We need strong commitments and ambition and pathways to decarbonization from governments, of the kind that China has just made. China is the world's largest emitter. So when China says that by 2060, we will be at net zero, that is incredibly powerful.
You talked about China and the role they're making. What do you see as their role in driving global sustainability?
We've seen already the very influential role that China's played in the scaling up of renewables globally. They drove the cost revolution for wind and solar, and we believe that they can possibly do the same for electrification of vehicles, for developing hydrogen. And so China will really be key in helping the whole world reach net zero, hopefully by mid-century.
Let's go back to green investment, because the problem is that every major economy has a different framework, a different way of doing things. It's a regulatory mess, isn't it? How do you get businesses to be able to see the wood for the trees?
Oh, that's a huge question and could take hours to answer. I do think that as we're coming out, particularly of what the world has been through this past year, I do think for the first time we're seeing a growing consensus around the need for sustainable investing. Everyone is at least speaking this language now. And I do believe that coming together, all stakeholders are going to start to need to do things, practical things to make this a reality. The world has to wake up. Carbon pricing, border adjustment taxes will sooner or later come and definitely will be introduced in major export markets. And so having access to green and clean energy will also start to become a factor in have a direct impact on competitiveness of manufacturing, of businesses. Consumers are going to start demanding more green and more sustainable products. And so I believe that certainly countries and businesses that green soonest are going to have a competitive edge in the future.
Well, we heard about all the stakeholders having a stake there, consumers, wider society. And concerns about climate change are now increasing worldwide, particularly among young people. In the biggest opinion poll yet on the issue, 64% of 1.2 million people surveyed recognise the crisis as an emergency. And almost half the participants were aged between 14 and 18. The top 4 policies they want to see tackled: the conservation of forests, renewable power, climate-friendly farming and investment in green jobs and in green businesses. Well, Bella Lack is a young environmentalist on the Global Climate Campaign trail.
I think for many of the activists I know around me, there's sort of a psychological awareness that our futures are in peril because of inaction and because of apathy. And I think people have sort of fallen into this complacency because we think that it's just this psychological awareness of something intangible in the future. But actually, I've been working on a project recently where I've been speaking to young people all over the world on Zoom, and they're facing the effects now. They're on the front lines. So some of them are migrating from their islands, for example, in the Solomon Islands. Some young people are already having to walk many, many more miles because of drought. So climate change isn't some intangible sort of crisis for the future. It's actually something affecting many people, especially young people, women and minority communities right now all over the world.
What role do you think that global business can play?
I think the problem with global business at the moment is no one really wants to be first. But, you know, there are these social tipping points, just as there are environmental tipping points. And once businesses realize that actually there are huge consumer demands and huge citizen demands for change, they need to be the ones to make that change, whether that be through restructuring their values. So, for example, putting green values and putting environmentalism at the heart of what they do, rather than sort of prioritizing just profit. Because ultimately, if you just prioritize profit, then the success is going to be very short term. We can't continue to have this infinite growth on a finite planet.
At Davos, the theme is the big reset. So how do you see that?
Anything with great at the beginning sort of makes me skeptical. And I think a lot of it is lip service and pledges, because right now we haven't seen any action. And until those hypothetical pledges which are being made are translated into action, then we have to remain skeptical, and we have to, all of us as citizens, have to keep our eye on what's happening and sort of be the watchdogs to make sure that these pledges do translate into action. Just like with the fact that the UK government has declared a climate emergency. Has much happened since then? No, not at all. So it's up to all of us to make sure that those words do turn into concrete action.
Do you think that young people feel that their voices are being heard?
I think what's important is actually that people are listening to the messages, not just the voices. Because as you can see with what's happened with Greta Thunberg, lots of people have been focused on, for example, her family, what mode of transport she's getting, and actually losing the message among all those other details. So what's really important is that we hold the message to heart, which is what the scientists are saying, which is what the environmentalists and the ecologists have been saying for a long time, which is that we have to act as though we're in a crisis and treat it as though we're in a crisis.
Well, on Thursday, day 4 of Davos, we'll hear from India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and delegates will also be looking at technology, from cryptocurrencies to how digital innovation can boost economic growth. Jamie.
Juliet, thank you very much. The rating agency S&P has warned 13 oil and gas companies that it may downgrade them because of increasing competition from renewable energy. That list includes Chevron, ExxonMobil and Shell. The rating agency said it had increased its risk rating for the entire oil and gas sector to moderately high. With a move away from fossil fuels, S&P said the companies were facing poor profitability. A surge in demand for new Xbox consoles, as well as further growth in cloud computing, helped Microsoft deliver better-than-expected results over Christmas. The shares climbed 4%. That's added to big gains made over the last year. Microsoft said Xbox hardware revenues grew by 86%, driven by the launch of its latest models, while demand for content and services for them was up by 40%. The computer games retailer GameStop shares have surged again after Elon Musk tweeted just the word GameStonk. The Tesla CEO shared the tweet with a link to Reddit's Wall Street Bet stock trading discussion group. The firm is now valued at $10 billion. Amateur investors on the Reddit group began buying up stock in a battle against hedge funds who've taken out short positions on the assumption that GameStop stock will go down. Goldman Sachs has cut the pay of its chief executive, David Solomon, by $10 billion. It follows the bank having to pay billions of dollars to settle an international investigation into its role in the 1MDB scandal. Solomon was still granted a $15.5 million bonus on top of his $2 million salary. Amazon has halted sales of alcohol in Northern Ireland and is preparing to delist more products. Due to new Brexit customs rules, the retailer is concerned that excise duty will have to be paid twice on shipments sent from Britain. The UK left the EU single market in December, but a regulatory border through the Irish Sea was created to prevent a hard border on the island of Ireland.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a grim milestone. How did the UK reach 100,000 COVID deaths?
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Don't forget you can sign up to our daily newsletter. We bring you all the top business headlines straight to your inbox. So sign up for free at this address. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe.
Tensions have continued to escalate between AstraZeneca and the European Union amid a dispute over vaccine supply shortages. The EU is demanding the pharmaceutical company publish their agreed contract. Let's talk to our correspondent Tony Waterman, who is in Brussels. So, Tony, what else have the EU had to say?
Well, one key piece of information which came out today is that, according to Brussels at least, this contract that Europe has with AstraZeneca entitles it to vaccine doses which are produced in 4 plants, 2 in the UK, one in Belgium and one in Germany. So the EU wants AstraZeneca to take some of these doses, which are produced in the UK, which, again, it believes it has the rights to, and use those to help make up for this shortfall. And AstraZeneca has all but ruled this out. The CEO has said that it's Britain which has first dibs on the vaccines which are produced in the UK. So this is part of the reason why Brussels is now pushing quite hard for this contract to be made public. But you can just imagine what sort of post-Brexit political brawl this could unleash if some of these vaccines start getting shipped from the UK into the EU, especially at a time when the EU itself is on the verge of imposing export control bans on vaccines which are produced in the EU. The other thing that came to light today is that the health commissioner has denied that the contract it has with AstraZeneca is one that is a best effort contract. The CEO had said that they had merely promised to get these vaccines out with no guarantees. When it comes to deliveries of these vaccines, we heard from an EU official today saying that only a quarter of the promised vaccines are actually going to be delivered in the first quarter. This is much less than what had been initially reported in the media, which said that 40% would actually be delivered. And this EU official saying that they have no insight going forward past March what those deliveries are going to look like, something that this individual called, quote, very strange.
And Tony, what has AstraZeneca had to say about all this?
Well, this has become a very ugly spat, he said, she said, back and forth. It's really difficult to keep track of where this is because it just keeps getting back and forth. So AstraZeneca hasn't responded to this latest volley, but earlier in the day, the company did say that it understands the frustrations that Europe is experiencing right now. People, of course, are dying every single day, and the vaccines are seen as this light at the end of the tunnel. But the company's CEO was far more blunt and a bit more aggressive in his language in an interview that he did with some European newspapers, saying that Europe was getting too emotional.
After days of tongue-lashing by Brussels, AstraZeneca's CEO came out swinging, laying the blame for a shortfall in vaccine deliveries at the EU's doorstep. In an interview with Italy's La Repubblica newspaper, Pascal Soriot said Europe was late to order the jab, 3 months behind the UK, and because of this, AstraZeneca only agreed to try its best without any guarantee it was going to succeed. AstraZeneca says the late start also means EU manufacturing facilities have been playing catch-up and are far less efficient in churning out doses than their UK counterparts. Soriot also denied that the company was diverting doses from the EU to other customers. The details of the contract, which secure up to 400 million doses of the vaccine for the bloc, have not been made public. But Brussels isn't backing down from demands that pharma companies deliver on their promises.
Let me be crystal clear. The 27 European Union member states are united that AstraZeneca needs to deliver on its commitments in our agreements. We are in a pandemic. We lose people every day.
AstraZeneca isn't the only pharma coming up short. Pfizer also said deliveries of its COVID-19 shot would be delayed. In a bid to ease supply shortages across the bloc, French drug maker Sanofi said it will open its manufacturing sites in Frankfurt to Pfizer and BioNTech this summer to help produce more than 125 million doses. The EU has struggled to ramp up its vaccine rollout with just over 2 doses administered per 100 people. That's compared to 11 in the UK and 7.5 in the US. The sluggish pace has provoked a backlash, now exacerbated by vaccine delivery delays. Germany wants the EU to grant member states the power to block the export of EU-manufactured vaccines. More details on the export control mechanism are expected by the end of the week.
Now, the next chapter in this saga is set to be written in about an hour from now, because that is when AstraZeneca and the European Commission and member states are going to be meeting again to try to resolve this issue. But ultimately, the Commission saying today it wants this to be resolved because it wants and it desperately needs these vaccines.
Okay, Tony Mortimer in Brussels, many thanks for that update.
British residents returning from 22 high-risk countries will have to quarantine in hotels. The move was confirmed by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and is aimed at heading off the spread of new coronavirus variants from abroad. But aviation groups say stricter rules will be catastrophic for the industry. This comes as the UK government faces criticism over its handling of the pandemic after the country passed 100,000 deaths, the fifth highest in the world. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Naweed Jabarkal in London, who's been following the story for us. Naweed, why is this decision on hotel quarantines being brought in now?
Well, Jamie, it's almost a year we've been covering the coronavirus here in the UK, and I can't tell you how many times people have asked me the same question. Why hasn't the UK closed its borders? In recent weeks, the government's tried to get tougher on its borders in the early stages of the pandemic, unlike countries like Australia and New Zealand, which closed early on and have seen much lower rates of the virus. The UK said there was no evidence to suggest that closing the borders would have prevented its spread here. But in recent weeks, they've changed tack. New measures have been rolled out. Firstly, testing. People who come to the UK have to get tests 72 hours before they arrive. Prime Minister reiterating that in Parliament today. He also highlighted the fact that most people who are in the UK are not allowed to travel. That's been a contentious issue because all over social media it's been awash with UK celebrities and others going on holiday. The Prime Minister saying border police will get tougher. Anyone trying to come to places like Heathrow here and go abroad will not be allowed to do so unless they have a valid reason. And then thirdly, hotel quarantines. That's also been announced by the Prime Minister, a red list of countries for those who are still allowed to come to the UK. They'll find that it'll be a little bit harder to do so from now.
Welcome to the UK. Now head to your hotel room to quarantine. That's the message facing travellers from high-risk countries who'll be told to isolate for 10 days upon arrival. It'll affect British residents coming back from places where new variants of the virus are spreading, like South Africa and Brazil.
We will introduce a new managed isolation process in hotels for those who cannot be refused entry, including those arriving home from countries where we have already imposed international travel bans. They will be required to isolate for 10 days without exception.
But with most foreign visitors already banned from coming to the UK, there are worries about how effective it'll be. Some ministers wanted to go even further and put travellers from all countries in hotels. Meanwhile, on British shores, the virus rages on. The UK's official death toll has passed 100,000 and continues to rise. Around half of those lives have been lost since early November. Some of Britain's top scientists say more decisive action sooner could have prevented some of those deaths. But facing lawmakers for the first time since the milestone was reached, the Prime Minister defended his choices.
And there has been no doubt that I and the government take full responsibility for all the actions I have taken, we've taken during this pandemic to fight this disease. And yes, Mr. Speaker, there will indeed be a time when we must learn the lessons of what has happened, reflect on them and prepare.
Today's decision on travel quarantines will go under the radar when compared to the sombre national mood. The deadly cost of COVID for the UK now in the six-figure range, with little sign of slowing down.
Naweed, you mentioned criticism over the UK government's handling of the pandemic. I wonder how widespread is that criticism? Is it just political? And how far is the UK government going to defend its position and its record?
Yeah, well, Boris Johnson really must feel like he's been attacked on all fronts and from all sides here. Let's start with the places you'd most expect it. The opposition Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, who leads the party, challenging Boris Johnson several times today to tell the country why the UK's death toll had passed 100,000. Boris Johnson saying that this wasn't the right time to answer those sorts of questions. It's not just the opposition asking questions, it's people behind Boris Johnson, his own party as well. Lawmakers saying, how long will these lockdowns go on? Lockdowns that are costing billions of dollars to the UK economy, so there's pressure and criticism from there as well. And then lastly, the scientific community, perhaps most importantly, saying that if decisions were taken sooner, then perhaps more lives could be saved. And a reminder of just how severe this second wave has been. 50,000 deaths recorded from March to November. From the 8th of November to now, another 50,000 roughly, showing just how serious it's been in recent weeks and months. And the latest indication, the latest figures coming out showing no sign of it slowing down. More than 1,700 deaths recorded in the past 24 hours.
Naweed Jabarkal, we'll talk again later in the programme, but for the moment, thank you very much.
The UK has the 5th highest death toll in the world and the highest death rate relative to its population. Roland Cow is an epidemiologist at the University of Edinburgh. He explained why the UK's figures are so high.
There are a number of things which contribute to the high death rate in the UK. One of them are essentially natural factors which are outside of COVID-19. So there are already high levels of obesity, for example, which do contribute because we know that those are contributing factors. There's also the way that the UK has handled the pandemic has been somewhat different. So there have been criticisms, for example, about the relatively late lockdown that Britain went into, for example, both in September and in way back in the spring, and issues that we've had with things like the test and trace system. And so, for example, an important contrast is Scotland versus England and the relative rates at which things have been happening.
Looking at the figures, we've seen a huge drop in the number of cases over January, but death rates are still high. So why the difference, and when do you think we're going to see a drop in the number of deaths?
Well, there's a few things happening there. I think one of the important ones is that deaths will always lag behind cases, simply because the period until individuals sadly die from COVID-19 is several weeks after the cases are detected. The other thing to consider is that, as many of your listeners will know, that there's a new variant of COVID-19 which has been spreading rapidly throughout Britain and appears to be associated with a higher death rate. So as that proportion goes up, we would expect the deaths to fall, but more slowly than we otherwise might have anticipated.
And to what extent do you think the current measures in place are helping curb the wave?
Well, the very good news we have is that the relatively extreme measures we have at the moment do seem to be making cases go down. So the reproduction number, the R rate that people have heard about, does appear to be below 1 universally. What we don't know, of course, is how long we have to stay under those circumstances in order to keep hospital numbers down and deaths down.
So you say how long? How long do you think we will be in this position?
Well, certainly the rates of cases are declining, slower than we would like, and as you've already pointed out, deaths haven't yet gone down in quite the same way, or hospitalizations. The anticipation it would be at least several weeks before any decision can be made. Probably we're looking at something on the order of later in March before any significant reductions in restrictions might even be thought about.
And how about globally speaking? When do you think we will start to see our way out of this pandemic?
Well, you know, as we all know, the spread of the distribution of the vaccine has been really good in some countries, less good in others. And in particular, in the lower income countries, we've gotten very little vaccine at all. So, you know, if we're thinking about this as a global problem rather than one country by country, we really need to get the pandemic under control everywhere. It could be a very long time, unfortunately.
Boeing shares are lower after the aircraft maker reported a record net loss of $11.9 billion in the fourth quarter. The news comes as EU regulators say the company's 737 MAX plane is safe to return to service in Europe. This ends a nearly 2-year flight ban for the jet after 2 crashes which caused more than 300 deaths. Well, let's talk to John Grant, who's a chief analyst at global travel data provider OAG. John, first of all, a senior manager at Boeing's 737 plant in Seattle, warned that recertification had happened too quickly. Who should we believe, him or Boeing, responsible for 300 deaths, or the regulators who missed the aircraft's fatal flaws?
I think we have to trust the regulators because they regulate just not this aircraft but every other commercial aircraft that's in operation. What we had seen was a really cosy, close relationship between Boeing and the FAA, who are their regulator, and shortcuts were being taken. And you know, the inquiry came down very heavily and criticised both the FAA and Boeing about that. So I would be amazed if just one person with a concern had not already been contacted by the FAA and asked to clarify exactly what their concern was. And interestingly, on this occasion, most other countries accept the approval of the FAA because they are experts and Boeing are a very big country, very big company. But on this occasion, the European Union and every other major country is applying its own regulatory approval. So I'm very surprised if that's going to be an issue.
Certification is obviously a major step forward for Boeing, but winning back passenger confidence and, of course, the pandemic both remain major obstacles, don't they?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic is probably more of an obstacle at this moment in time than the actual aircraft type. You know, we've got to rebuild as an industry consumer confidence, health protocols. We've not been helped by any governments talking to each other and developing common standards. And we're only now 12 months into this event beginning to talk about travel passports. So I think we've got to rebuild that confidence, and thereafter the MAX has its own challenges that it needs to overcome. And airline CEOs need to be both sympathetic to consumers and customers who may spot they're on this aircraft and want to change their reservation, and indeed to their own staff who may have some hesitancy about operating. It's got to be a carefully managed reintroduction back into commercial use.
We were just broadcasting from Heathrow Airport. Normally our correspondents struggle to be heard. The skies are empty, no one's flying. I wonder, with current restrictions in place, certification is unlikely to have any practical effect, surely?
Absolutely. The benefit for airlines who have this aircraft is that, you know, it's 20% cheaper to operate. But quite frankly, at the moment, you know, they're washing around with about 25% of seats being filled. So they don't have any problems about capacity. Yes, they'd like to reduce their operating cost. And indeed, it's a buyer's market for this aircraft, as Ryanair, as they typically do, stepped in last month and placed an order for more 737 MAXs. But, you know, for many airlines, this is just another problem. Crews have got to be retrained, they've got to be recertified, cabin staff have got to go through their checks and their certification programs. It's just, you know, it's not required at this moment in time.
John Grant in London, thank you very much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. We're in Germany as specialist clinics become the first in the EU to treat COVID-19 patients with expensive and experimental antibody cocktails.
The allocation of tiers will be reviewed every 14 days, starting on the 16th of December.
And it will see some parts of the country move into even tougher limits on their lives than before the current lockdown. That's unlikely to go down well with some local leaders.
Since the beginning of November, admissions to intensive care units across Italy have almost doubled.
The UK government is well invested with 100 million doses pre-ordered as and when the vaccine becomes ready.
And of the disruption being caused by COVID-19, Germany's famous Christmas markets have all but been cancelled.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
Roger, make you loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very busy when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. World leaders set out to tackle climate change at the World Economic Forum.
AstraZeneca versus the EU. The drug maker and the European Union fall out over a vaccine shortfall.
And Boeing's highs and lows. EU regulators clear the 737 MAX for a return to the skies, but the plane maker unveils record losses. Specialist clinics in Germany will become the first in the EU to treat COVID-19 patients with expensive and experimental antibody cocktails. This comes after the government bought 200,000 doses of what are called monoclonal antibodies, which are 10 times more expensive than the Pfizer vaccine. Ryan Thompson explains.
When a COVID-19 diagnosis sent former U.S. President Donald Trump from the White House to the hospital, doctors were quick to use a powerful but unproven treatment of steroids, antivirals, and antibodies.
We're in a bit of uncharted territory when it comes to a patient that received the therapies he has so early in the course.
But the same treatment has been unavailable in Europe until now. Germany has bought over $450 million worth of monoclonal antibody therapies, and German COVID-19 wards will become the first in the EU to use the experimental treatment.
What we do not have, and no country really has, is a functioning medication. So remdesivir and all other candidates turned out to be useless and are no longer recommended to be used in the clinical treatment course of COVID-19. And the only approach besides an active immunization by a vaccine is this passive immunization.
Both drugs acquired by Germany's health ministry harness antibodies in the same way, by blocking the virus from spreading to new cells and making patients even sicker. 200,000 doses are reportedly included in a deal with American pharmaceutical giants Eli Lilly and Regeneron. But though the treatment has been credited with saving the lives of thousands fighting severe cases of COVID-19, no monoclonal antibody therapies have been approved for COVID-19 use by the EU medicines regulator. Opposition MP Andrew Ullman is a general practitioner and worries that German health authorities will distribute the treatment without a proper warning label.
I do welcome the purchase, but on the other hand, one thing concerns me. We need appropriate clinical trials that actually proves the efficacy of a drug and the safety of a drug, and we need to know the doses. And if that's not possible, patients could receive the drug, but they have to be aware that this drug is not approved and they are participating in a trial.
European regulators have not yet given a date for reviewing these drugs, though their American counterparts have already given the emergency green light in early November. Late-stage studies released this week suggest that Regeneron, one of the two drugs acquired by Germany, could prevent symptoms in the majority of cases. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Frankfurt.
The French government is advising people not to wear certain homemade masks in public, saying they do not offer sufficient protection from the newer, more contagious COVID-19 variants. It says only 3 types of masks are recommended for use. Ross Cullen is in Paris with more.
Since making it compulsory last autumn to wear a face mask in public, up until now, France's government has not made any specific recommendations about the types of masks that it wants people to wear. But now, only 3 types of face mask will be recommended for public use. These disposable medical coverings will be allowed. Also permitted will be these FFP2 standard masks, and also certain fabric face coverings will be allowed to be worn as long as they conform to medical standards. Now, this isn't a new law, it's strong guidance from the government based on recommendations from France's Public Health Agency. The government says the aim is to ensure better individual protection, but above all, better collective protection by ensuring that the maximum number of people wear a mask that filters enough. But despite this move, the World Health Organization says that fabric face coverings can be fully effective if they're worn properly, and the recommendation was criticised by France's Academy of Medicine that says there is a lack of scientific proof that homemade masks do not offer sufficient protection if they are also worn properly. Face masks have been compulsory in indoor public places and in outdoor public spaces in France since last autumn, and there is a potential $160 fine if you do not wear one. Despite these new recommendations, the French authorities admit that it will be difficult to enforce, and a spokesperson for the Prime Minister, for Jean Castex, said that I don't imagine the police are going to be asking people about the specific level of protection that their face mask offers. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
And face masks are becoming mandatory across a number of countries in Europe. And now that we can only see half our colleagues' or friends' faces, subtle forms of communication, such as a smile, are lost. CGTN Europe has been speaking to a body language expert with 5 top tips on effective communication while wearing a mask. More at europe.cgtn.com or on our social media accounts, where we would love to know if you have any tips of your own. Slovakia has completed its latest round of nationwide mass testing for COVID-19, with results showing 1.8% of people have the virus. Nearly half the country's 5.5 million people took part. Just over 30,000 tested positive. Now they must isolate. Another testing program will begin next week, but only in the worst-hit areas. Slovakia ran 2 mass testing programs late last year. The leaders of Indian farmers have distanced themselves from Monday's violence, which saw thousands storm the historic Red Fort in New Delhi. The protesters have now returned to their camps on the outskirts of the capital. They're demanding the scrapping of new agricultural laws, which they say will damage their livelihoods. The government has offered to suspend the new laws for 18 months. China has launched an investigation into the cause of a mine explosion that left 10 workers dead and 1 still missing. 22 miners were trapped after an explosion at a gold mine in China's Shandong province. A rescue operation pulled 11 workers from the mine 2 weeks after the blast. The owner of the mine was criticised for a 30-hour delay in reporting the incident, and 2 officials were removed from office for their alleged role in the late reporting. Joe Biden has spoken to Vladimir Putin for the first time since taking office, with the US president raising concerns over the treatment of Alexei Navalny. The high-profile opposition figure, a vocal critic of the Russian president, was jailed after returning to Moscow from Germany, where he was recovering after being exposed to Novichok. Mr. Navalny blamed the nerve agent attack on the Kremlin, which it has denied.
The new US President Joe Biden should bring the China-United States relationship back to a sound and steady track and mark a return to multilateralism. That's according to China's ambassador to the EU, Zhong Ming. Lucy Hoff has the story.
2 days after Chinese President Xi Jinping and German Chancellor Angela Merkel expressed their agreement at the World Economic Forum on the need for multilateralism, that message was echoed again in Brussels on Wednesday by China's ambassador to the EU, Zhong Ming. He, like President Xi, warned against confrontation and said he hoped the new Biden administration would be willing to manage differences after 4 difficult years of US foreign policy.
We hope that the U.S. could join our efforts to step up cooperation, manage differences, and bring China-U.S. relations back to a sound and steady track.
We know that President Biden has spoken this week to several European leaders, including Germany's Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron, seeking a more coordinated transatlantic alliance towards China. But German Chancellor Angela Merkel says she wants to avoid what she described as building blocks against the other, preferring instead to act as a coordinator between Washington and Beijing. Merkel is also the main sponsor amongst EU leaders of the long sought-after investment agreement, which widens EU-China market access and was finally signed off on schedule at the end of last year. Ambassador Zhang Ming said the agreement would not just boost EU-China investment, but boost global economic recovery from COVID-19.
The agreement is the first high-standard investment agreement between 2 of the top 3 economies in the world, and therefore could serve as a good example. The document, the agreement will further remove barriers to the two-way investment between China and the EU, and contribute to a large investment ecosystem across Europe and Asia.
While the investment treaty has broad support amongst EU member states, it is likely to be met with some resistance as it moves through the European Parliament, with MEPs subjecting its terms to heavy scrutiny. The devil is likely to be in the detail, and the process may not be completed until early next year. Lucy Hoff, CGTN, Brussels.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, more on the UK's tougher coronavirus restrictions as the country reports another 1,700 deaths over the last 24 hours.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing, and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN. Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. More now on one of our top stories, the latest on the fallout from the UK's COVID-19 death toll, which has now reached 100,000 people. Let's return to our correspondent, Naweed Jabarkal, who's following the story for us in London. Naweed, more grim figures just out. Just talk us through them.
Yeah, the latest 24-hour period, the figures released, Jamie, 1,725 people have lost their lives to coronavirus. That's the highest daily death toll since the pandemic began. More tough figures for Boris Johnson as criticism grows over his government's handling of the virus. He did appear in front of lawmakers earlier today to answer questions after the country passed the 100,000 mark. And what we've seen really from Boris Johnson is an attempt to try and deflect attention away from other members of his cabinet and take full responsibility, is what he said, for the government's response to the pandemic. But crucially, he did say that the government has done everything in its power to try and reduce some of those deaths. Not everyone agrees. The opposition party, the Labour Party, says more could have been done. Scientists say if more decisive action was taken sooner, particularly around November and the second lockdown that the country went into, then more lives could have been saved. But it's not all bad news for Boris Johnson. There is one glimmer of hope, particularly around vaccinations. The latest figures there suggest that more than 7.1 million people have now received a first dose of a vaccine. The target for the government is 15 million people in the country, the most vulnerable 4 groups, 15 million people to reach their first jab by the middle of February. So it looks like the UK is well on track there. Boris Johnson's marking a sombre mood today, really summing up the mood across the nation in the past 24 hours. And he's set to appear in front of a press conference at Downing Street. Quite rare for him to appear at these press conferences. He's about to step out for another one for the second time in the space of about 24 hours.
Naweed, I was watching the House of Commons and there were some pretty grim faces in front of the Prime Minister. What's your sense of what this means politically for Boris Johnson?
Yeah, it's quite rare to see a political figure like Boris Johnson with the sort of body language I noticed today. His head was down quite a lot, and I think he would have been relieved, Jamie, not to have physical opposition in front of him. Sir Keir Starmer, the opposition leader, he's isolating once again, so his questions were through video conference. But really, Boris Johnson, like I said, trying to sum up the mood in this country, the 100,000 people. We hear lots of facts and figures thrown around this pandemic, but in reality, that's 100,000 fathers, brothers, mothers, sisters, loved ones that have been lost in the virus, as Boris Johnson said himself, passing his deepest condolences, as he called. So he realises the severity of the challenge ahead of him. But just in terms of moving forward, I think for the general population who may not have been affected by loved ones, it's about the lockdown, and there the Prime Minister says the earliest that could change will be in early March.
Louise Jabarkle in London, thank you very much.
Now, virtual reality was once the stuff of science fiction, but it's increasingly a very real part of our lives. The global market for VR technology is expected to grow fivefold between 2018 and 2023, and training simulations will make up a large proportion of this. Catherine Bajikian reports.
Hey, I read the article about One Roast.
This is Barry. He's an employee with concerns about his job security.
We're not going to be next, are we?
This virtual reality simulation is designed by a company called Tailspin in the United States to train managers on how to have difficult conversations with employees. And it's not the only company doing something like this. This simulation was created by audit giant PwC, which employs over 250,000 people globally. The aim is to put staff in the shoes of a marginalized person as they experience everyday discrimination.
So I can tell you right now, it's not a matter of whether it's going to be a thing in the future. Virtual reality for training purposes, and in particular soft skills training and practical skills training, is an area that's being used by organizations across different industries all over the world right now.
In 2018, businesses spent $829 million on VR. That market is expected to increase fivefold by 2023, as total investment in the technology will surpass $4 billion a year. And while some of that will be used for everyday operations, like virtual meetings, training simulations are expected to make up a large proportion of the increase. That's because VR elicits an emotional response, similar to what you experience in reality, even when it's obvious that the images aren't real.
Listen, you can give it to me straight. I just want to know what I'm supposed to tell my girls.
People responded really strongly to it. I mean, we had people cry. We had a lot of people with sweaty palms, you know. They just got super uncomfortable in the moment. And so we just thought that was really interesting, that we could evoke those types of behavioral aspects, even though everybody knew it was 100% fake, including the virtual humans, even specifically to be designed to be a little bit cartoony.
The repetition of VR training means an individual can learn 4 times faster than in a classroom, according to a study by PwC. Other sectors are also investing in this technology. This program was created in part by professors at Goldsmiths, University of London, to test if VR can train doctors on how to recognize the signs of abuse.
The idea is that before we get medical doctors to probably go out and talk to real patients, they can practice with virtual patients. So they can make all the mistakes they would otherwise make with real patients, and then they can learn from this experience. They can experience it multiple times, right? Because there is a psychological journey you go through in difficult conversations that you can actually practice. And VR really triggers all this in your body.
VR technology is still relatively new, but in the next 10 years, it is possible that work-related training will take place in the virtual world instead of in the classroom. Catherine Berjikian, CGTN, London.
And that's virtually it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, or search for CGTN in your app store. And follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.